She had exactly 3 days before the bank took everything her family had ever built, and her only option was to propose marriage to a man she'd never met before in her life. This is the story of Clara Whitlock and Gideon Mercer, two strangers thrown together by desperation, hardship, and a frontier that showed no mercy to the weak. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now settle in, because this one is going to take a while. The horse showed up first. It came over the ridge at a slow, tired walk, picking its way down the rutted wagon trail like it was choosing each step carefully, like one wrong move might finish it. The animal was a muddy roan with hollow flanks and a saddle that had seen better years, maybe better decades. Behind it sat a man who didn't look much better than the horse. Clara Whitlock noticed him from the kitchen window while she was scrubbing the breakfast pan. She didn't panic. She didn't reach for the rifle above the door. She just watched, the way a woman learns to watch when she's been alone on a remote piece of land long enough to know that strangers usually meant one of three things: trouble, more trouble, or men looking for work. She dried her hands on her apron and walked outside. The man rode into the yard and stopped. He was lean in the way that working men get lean, not skinny, but worn down to the useful parts. Somewhere around 30, she guessed, with a jaw that needed shaving and eyes that were doing the same thing her eyes were doing, measuring, calculating, deciding how much to trust. He pulled off his hat. That was a good sign. Men who meant harm rarely bothered. "Morning," he said. His voice came out rougher than he probably intended, like he hadn't spoken to anyone in a few days. "Morning," Clara answered. She stayed near the porch steps, not running back inside, but not walking toward him either. "You lost?" "No, ma'am." He shifted in the saddle. "Saw your place from the ridge. I'm looking for work, any kind. I'm good with cattle, fences, horses. I can do carpentry if needed. I don't drink on the job and I don't cause trouble." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked past him at the road he'd come from, checking out of habit whether anyone was following. "What's your name?" "Gideon Mercer." "Where from?" He hesitated just a half second. "Most recently, up near Abilene. Before that, I moved around some." She nodded slowly. Drifters were common enough out here. Men who couldn't settle, or wouldn't, or had reasons not to. She'd learned not to judge that too quickly. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I do have work that needs doing, more than I can handle alone, if I'm being honest." She paused. "But I don't need a hired hand." He waited, not sure where that was going. "Come inside," she said. "I'll put coffee on. What I have to say is better said sitting down." He sat at her kitchen table with his hat in his hands while she poured 2 mugs of coffee that was stronger than it probably needed to be. The kitchen was clean but spare, practical. Everything had a purpose. Nothing was decorative. There were ledger books stacked near the window, a worn map of the property tacked to the wall, and a single framed photograph on the shelf. A man she didn't mention and he didn't ask about. Clara sat across from him and wrapped both hands around her mug. "I'm going to say something strange," she said. "I need you to hear the whole thing before you react." Gideon nodded carefully. "I have 3 days before the First Cattlemen's Bank of Harmon County calls in my husband's debt. If that happens, they take this land. All 412 acres of it." She said it evenly, like she'd rehearsed saying it without falling apart. "The debt isn't mine. It was my late husband Robert's. Loans he took before he died, contracts he signed that I didn't know about until after the funeral. Under Texas law right now, I don't have the authority to renegotiate the terms, not as a widow acting alone." Gideon sat very still. "But a married woman would?" "A married woman with a husband who co-signs the refinancing agreement would." She looked at him directly. "I need a husband, Mr. Mercer, not a cowboy." The silence in the kitchen stretched out long enough to be uncomfortable. "You're serious?" he said. It wasn't a question. "Completely." He set down his coffee mug, looked at the table, looked back at her. "Ma'am, you don't know me. I rode in off that road 20 minutes ago." "I know." She didn't flinch. "I also know that I've spent the last 6 weeks trying to find another solution, and there isn't one. The bank won't wait. My brother in Austin won't lend me the money. He doesn't have it either. The neighboring ranchers either can't help or won't. She paused. I'm not asking you to love me. I'm not asking you to pretend. I'm asking you to sign some papers, put your name next to mine, and give me a legal standing that the law won't give me on my own. And in return? Fair wages, $30 a month, which is better than most ranches in this county. Your own room in the bunkhouse, 3 meals a day, and whatever work you're willing to put in. When the ranch is stable, if we can get it stable, we can dissolve the arrangement quietly. People do it. It's not unheard of. Gideon was quiet for a long time. He turned the coffee mug slowly in his hands without drinking from it. What happened to your husband? He finally asked. Claire's expression shifted, but only slightly. He fell from a horse 14 months ago, broke his neck. He was dead before I reached him. She said it clean and fast, the way you say something you've had to say too many times. He was a good man. He just borrowed more than he should have. And the ranch? You've been running it alone since then? Me and one part-time hand who left for New Mexico 2 months ago when I couldn't guarantee his wages. Gideon looked around the kitchen again, at the ledger books, at the map, at the photograph on the shelf. He thought about the yard he'd ridden through, the repaired fence post that had been fixed by someone working alone, the garden that was still being kept despite everything, the barn that needed paint but was structurally sound. She hadn't let the place go. That meant something. I'd want to look at the books, he said. Clara blinked. That wasn't the response she'd expected. I'm sorry? If I'm going to put my name on a refinancing agreement, I need to see what I'm signing on to. I want to look at the debt terms, the property records, and whatever income the ranch has been generating. He looked at her steadily. I'm not saying no. I'm saying I need to understand what I'm agreeing to. She studied him for a moment. Then she stood up, went to the shelf, pulled down the first ledger, and set it in front of him. Start there, she said. What? He was still reading 2 hours later when Clara came back from feeding the horses. She'd half expected him to be gone, to have ridden off the moment she stepped outside, spooked by the strangeness of the situation. Men ran from complicated things. That had been her experience. But when she came back through the kitchen door, he was right where she'd left him, the ledger open, 3 pages of rough notes scrawled on a piece of paper he must have found somewhere on the table. He looked up. Your eastern boundary, he said. When was it last surveyed? Clara frowned. Original survey was done in 1871. Why? He tapped a line in the ledger. Because there's a reference here in your husband's records to a conversation with a man named Prewitt, a land agent. And the way it's written, it sounds like there was a question raised about the accuracy of the eastern line at some point. He paused. Do you have the original survey documents? In the box under the desk in the office. Can I see them? She brought them out. He spread them on the table and studied them for another long stretch without saying anything. Clara sat across from him and waited, watching the concentration on his face, the way his brow drew together, the way his finger traced slowly along drawn lines. I don't know yet if it matters, he finally said, but I think there might be something here. He looked up. I'll do it. Clara went still. You'll marry me. I'll sign the papers. I'll help you get the refinancing done, and I'll work the ranch while we figure out the rest. He folded the notes he'd made and tucked them into his shirt pocket. But I want to be straight with you, Mrs. Whitlock. I'm not doing this out of charity. I've been drifting for 6 years and I'm tired of it. If this place can be made into something worth staying for, I'd like the chance to help make it that way. That's what I get out of this. Clara looked at him carefully. You could walk away any time you decided it wasn't worth it. So could you, he said. Seems fair. For the first time since he'd ridden into her yard, something in Clara's expression softened. Not much, and not for long, but enough. All right, Mr. Mercer, she said. Then we have a deal. The justice of the peace in Harmon Creek was a stout, skeptical man named Judge Harold Briggs, who had married 17 couples in his courtroom, and by his own reckoning, had long since stopped asking too many questions about why people wanted to get married. He looked at Clara Whitlock and Gideon Mercer standing in front of his desk, her in a clean gray dress, him in a coat that was too large in the shoulders and had been borrowed from somewhere, and he read the necessary words in a voice that suggested he had read them approximately 10,000 times before. "Do you, Gideon Mercer, take this woman?" "I do," Gideon said. A little too fast, maybe, but the judge didn't blink. "And do you, Clara Whitlock?" "I do," Clara said. She kept her eyes forward the whole time. Briggs stamped the certificate, pushed it across the desk, told them to sign on the indicated lines. They signed. He shook both their hands with identical firmness. "Congratulations," he said, in a tone that indicated he didn't particularly need them to be. They walked out of the courthouse together into a gray October afternoon. The wind smelled like rain coming. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "Well," Clara finally said. "Well," Gideon agreed. They went to the bank. Douglas Harder, the loan officer at First Cattleman's, was the kind of man who had spent so long administering other people's misfortunes that he'd started to resemble one himself, pale and tight-faced, with a permanent expression of polite impatience. He looked up when they came in and registered immediate surprise. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said. And then, "I don't believe I know my husband," Clara said. "Gideon Mercer. We married this morning." Harder's eyes moved between them. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite approval, but a reassessment. "I see," he said. "We're here to discuss the refinancing of the property debt," Gideon said. He stepped forward and placed the marriage certificate and the property deed on the desk. His voice was unhurried, but there was a firmness in it. "We'd like to begin that process today, if that's workable." Harder looked at the papers, then at Gideon. "You understand the terms of the current obligation?" "I do. I've reviewed the ledgers thoroughly." Gideon sat down without being invited to, which made Harder blink. "And I think we can arrive at an arrangement that protects the bank's interests and allows the ranch to operate without the constant pressure of an accelerated repayment schedule." Clara sat down beside him. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She'd watched Gideon go through those ledgers for 2 hours, and she'd seen how carefully he'd understood them. She let him talk. The meeting lasted over an hour. When they finally walked back out into the street, the rain had started, a cold, thin drizzle that plastered Clara's hair to her cheek when she turned to look at him. "You negotiated 3 extra months," she said. "He was going to offer 2. I held out." "How did you know he'd go to 3? Gideon pulled up his collar against the rain. "Because he needs the ranch to succeed as much as you do. A bank that forecloses on a widow's land in a county this small doesn't make friends." He glanced at her. "He wasn't your enemy in there. He was just a man doing a job. It matters, knowing the difference." Clara looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Then she turned and walked toward where they'd tied the horses. "Come on, Mr. Mercer," she said. "We've got a ranch to get back to." The first week was strange in the specific, exhausting way that all impossible situations are strange. Not dramatic, just uncomfortable in small and constant ways. They were, in every legal sense, married. But in every practical sense, they were 2 people who didn't know each other trying to share a property, a workload, and occasionally a table at dinner. Gideon moved into the bunkhouse. Clara made no comment about this, and he made none about the room that had been offered with obvious relief. They ate breakfast together because there was 1 kitchen and 1 stove. And that arrangement was simply efficient. Sometimes they talked. Often they didn't. But they worked. The morning after they returned from town, Gideon was up before dawn fixing the section of fence along the south pasture that had been sagging for, by the look of it, months. Clara came out at first light with coffee in both hands and found him already halfway through. "You don't have to start today," she said. He took the coffee. "Why not?" She didn't have a good answer for that. He wasn't the fastest worker she'd ever seen, but he was steady and thorough. When he fixed something, it stayed fixed. He didn't cut corners, and he didn't do things halfway, and he had the particular kind of stubbornness that keeps a man going after his hands have gone stiff with cold and his back has been hurting since morning. By the end of the first week, the south fence was done. The barn roof had 2 new boards where it had been leaking into the hay storage, and Gideon had started a rough accounting of the herd. How many head, their condition, which ones would go to market, which ones needed to be watched through winter. He kept the notes on the eastern boundary survey tucked in his shirt pocket. He hadn't mentioned it again. Not yet. He He wanted to understand it better before he said anything to Clara, but he hadn't forgotten it. On the 9th night, Clara came out onto the porch after dinner and found Gideon sitting on the steps with the survey documents spread across his knees, squinting at them in the last light. "You're still looking at those," she said. "There's something wrong with the eastern line." He held up the map. "Right here. This stake position. See how it's referenced against the creek bend?" Clara sat down on the top step and leaned over to look. Their shoulders were close, but not quite touching. "I see the creek bend." That bend moved. Not much, maybe 50 yards, but creeks shift over time, especially after a bad flood season. If the original survey used that bend as a fixed reference point, and the bend has moved since 1871, then the eastern boundary line could be off. He paused. "I think it could be off by as much as a quarter mile." Clara looked at him. Gideon, that's a lot of land." "I know." "Why does that matter to—" She stopped. Something shifted in her expression. "Silas Crow," she said. His name came out flat and hard. Gideon nodded slowly. "He's been pressing you to sell. Politely, but he's been pressing." "For 2 years," Claire said. "Even before Robert died, Crow was coming around making offers. I never understood why he wanted this particular piece so badly. There are bigger ranches in the county." "There are," Gideon agreed. "But there aren't many with disputed boundary lines that a wealthy man with good lawyers might be able to exploit." He folded the map carefully. "If he knew about this surveying error, or suspected it, and he could get you off this land before you discovered it yourself, he might be able to make a legal argument for a portion of those acres." Clara was quiet for a long time. The sound of cattle settling down for the night drifted from the pasture. "What do we do?" she asked. "I want to contact a land surveyor," Gideon said. "A good one, not connected to anyone local. Have him come out and do a proper resurvey of the eastern boundary before we say anything to Crow or anyone else." He looked at her. "If I'm wrong, we've lost a few weeks and a surveyor's fee. If I'm right, then we have proof," Clara said. "Then we have proof," he agreed. She nodded slowly. "Do it." He stood up, tucking the documents carefully under his arm. He started to go inside, then paused at the door. "Mrs. Whitlock." "Clara?" she said, without looking up from where she was still staring out at the darkened pasture. "If you're going to risk your wages on a land surveyor for my benefit, you can at least use my first name." He was quiet for a moment. "Good night, Clara." "Good night, Gideon." He went inside. She sat on the porch for a while longer, listening to the wind work through the grass, thinking about a quarter mile of disputed land and a man who had shown up tired and broke at her front door 10 days ago and was already fighting harder for this place than anyone had in a long time. She didn't know what to make of him yet, but she was starting to think that might take a while to figure out. The surveyor's name was Edmund Price, and he came from San Antonio with a transit level, a leather satchel full of reference charts, and the particular brand of quiet confidence that belongs to men who have spent decades measuring things other people argue about. He was 60-something, unhurried, and completely unimpressed by the size of the Whitlock Ranch, or the urgency with which Gideon had written to him. He arrived on a Tuesday morning in early November, tied his horse at the post without being asked, looked out at the eastern pasture for a long moment the way a doctor looks at a patient before asking where it hurts, and then said, "Show me where your husband's records place the original stake." Gideon showed him. Clara watched from a distance while the two men walked the eastern boundary together, Price stopping every so often to crouch down and examine the ground, or to sight along the transit level toward the distant tree line. She had work of her own, there always was, but she kept finding reasons to be on that side of the property, checking the water trough, moving the horses to the east paddock, carrying a fence post that didn't especially need carrying anywhere in particular. Gideon caught her doing it around midday and said nothing, but the corner of his mouth moved in a way she was starting to recognize. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, and went back to holding the measuring line for Price. It took the better part of 2 days. Price was thorough to a degree that started to feel almost punishing. He walked every yard of that eastern line twice, checked his measurements against the creek bend position, referenced 3 separate county land records he'd brought from the capital, and filled an entire notebook with figures before he said anything conclusive. On the evening of the second day, He sat at Clara's kitchen table with his notebook open and both of them across from him, and he told them what he'd found. The original survey used the eastern bend of Redtail Creek as a fixed point, he said, tapping his notes. That bend has migrated approximately 60 yards south since 1871. Flooding, most likely. There were significant flood events in this region in 74 and again in 79. He turned the notebook so they could see the figures. The result is that your true eastern boundary sits roughly 230 yards east of where the current fencing runs. The kitchen was very quiet. How many acres? Gideon asked. In that strip, 41 acres, give or take, good grass on most of it. There's also a seasonal creek run that crosses through the lower portion. Price closed the notebook. Whoever has been using that land, they've been using land that legally belongs to this property. Clara set her hands flat on the table. Her voice, when she spoke, was controlled in a way that took visible effort. Silas Crow's cattle have been grazing that strip for at least 3 years. Price looked at her without particular surprise. That would explain some things. It would explain everything, Gideon said. After Price had been paid and his horse had disappeared back down the wagon trail toward town, Clara and Gideon stood in the yard in the cold dusk, and neither of them spoke for a bit. The wind moved through the dry grass with a sound like something being shuffled. Somewhere in the eastern pasture, a cow complained about something and then went quiet. He knew, Clara finally said. It wasn't a question, and she wasn't talking to Gideon so much as saying it out loud, because saying it made it real, and making it real was something she needed to do. Crow knew about this boundary error. He's been grazing his cattle on my land for 3 years and pressuring me to sell before I ever found out. That's how I read it, Gideon said. Robert would have found out eventually. Her voice dropped a note. Maybe Crow was counting on the debt to push us out before that happened. And then Robert died, and there I was alone. And it probably looked like the easiest thing in the world. Gideon glanced at her. Her jaw was tight, and her eyes had gone somewhere that wasn't the eastern pasture. Clara. I'm fine, she said quickly. I know. I'm still saying your name. She looked at him. He was watching her with an expression that wasn't pity. She wouldn't have been able to stand pity, but something else, something steadier than that. We don't confront him yet, Gideon said. We file the resurvey with the county first. Get it into the official record before Crow has any idea we've done it. Once it's filed, he can't challenge it quietly. It becomes a matter of public record. And if he finds out before we file, then we move faster. Gideon turned back toward the house. I'll ride to the county seat tomorrow morning. I want this done before the end of the week. Clara followed him inside. She was quiet through dinner, which she made without being asked and set on the table without ceremony. Salt pork and boiled potatoes. And the last of the cornbread, practical food, nothing extra. Gideon ate without complaint, which she'd come to appreciate in the 3 weeks he'd been here. Robert had been the same way. Some men made a production of not complaining. Gideon just actually didn't seem to. After dinner, she washed the dishes and he dried them, because that was what had started happening somewhere in the second week without either of them deciding it, and now it was just what they did. 41 acres, she said, passing him a plate. Good grass on most of it, he said, which was almost exactly what Price had said, and somehow that was the funniest thing either of them had heard in a while. Clara laughed, a real one, the kind that surprised her, and then felt faintly embarrassed by it, and then decided she didn't care. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh. He stored it away somewhere without meaning to. The ride to the county seat took most of the following day. Gideon left before dawn and came back after dark with the official receipt of filing and the county recorder's stamp on Price's revised survey documents. He found Clara in the barn finishing the last of the evening feeding, and he held up the receipt in the lamplight without saying anything. She looked at it. Then she exhaled, long and slow, like she'd been holding it in all day. It's filed, he said. Good, she said. She went back to forking hay, and he took off his coat and picked up the second fork and helped her finish, because there was still work to do, and the horses didn't care about county records. Silas Crow came calling 4 days later. Clara had met him before, of course. You couldn't be a landowner in Harmon County without meeting Silas Crow at some point, because he made it his business to know every acre and every owner within 30 miles of his own operation. He was a large man, well-dressed in the frontier fashion. Quality boots, good hat, a jacket that probably cost more than some men's monthly wages. He had silver hair and a pleasant, unhurried manner that Clara had always found faintly unsettling, the way you find something unsettling when you can't quite identify what's wrong with it. He rode in around mid-morning with one rider behind him, which was how men like Crow made visits. Never entirely alone, never with enough company to seem threatening, just enough to remind you of what was behind him if you looked past the pleasant manner. Gideon was on the barn roof replacing shingles when they rode in. He came down the ladder slowly without rushing and stood in the yard by the time Crow dismounted. Clara came out of the house and stood on the porch steps. "Mrs. Whitlock," Crow said, touching the brim of his hat. Then he looked at Gideon with an expression of controlled surprise. "I heard you'd remarried. I hadn't realized it was so recent." 3 weeks ago," Claire said. "This is my husband, Gideon Mercer." Crow extended his hand. Gideon shook it with the automatic courtesy of a man who has shaken unpleasant hands before. "Mr. Crow," he said. "Mercer." Crow released his hand and turned his attention back to Clara. "I came to extend my congratulations, of course, and to revisit a conversation we've had before regarding the property. I understand your situation has changed somewhat, and I wanted to—" "It has changed," Gideon said. Crow paused mid-sentence. He turned back to Gideon with that same pleasant expression, but something behind his eyes had sharpened. "I was speaking with Mrs. Whitlock." "You're welcome to speak with my wife," Gideon said pleasantly. "She makes her own decisions, but since the conversation seems to be heading toward the subject of this property, you should know that we've had the eastern boundary resurveyed. Professionally, with full documentation. It was filed with the county 4 days ago. The silence that followed was approximately 3 seconds long, but it had a quality to it. Something shifting, something recalculating behind Crow's face that he couldn't quite control in time. "Is that so?" he said. "It is. Turns out the original 1871 survey had an error. The actual eastern boundary sits about 200 yards east of where the old fence runs." Gideon kept his voice even, conversational. "Which means there are roughly 40 acres you've been grazing cattle on for the past few years that belong to this property." Crow's pleasant manner was still in place, but it had gone rigid at the edges, the way a smile goes when the person wearing it has stopped feeling it. "I'm sure there's some confusion about—" "There isn't," Gideon said. He reached into his coat and produced a folded copy of Price's survey, which he'd had made specifically for this moment. He held it out. "You're welcome to have your own people look at it. The Creek Bend reference is very clear." Crow did not take the paper. He looked at it, then at Gideon, and the calculation behind his eyes became briefly, nakedly visible. "How much does he know? How firm is this? What are my options?" And then the pleasant mask came back, smoother and harder than before. "Well," he said, "it sounds like this will be a matter for lawyers to sort out." "It will," Gideon agreed. "But since it's already on public record, I suspect the lawyers won't have much sorting to do." Crow looked at Clara then. She'd said nothing throughout the exchange, standing on the porch steps with her arms crossed and her expression completely level. Not triumphant, not afraid, just watching. "I hope this doesn't create any unnecessary unpleasantness between neighbors," Crow said. "We don't want any unpleasantness," Clara said. We just want our land." He held her gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he touched his hat, turned, and rode out of the yard with his man behind him without another word. When the sound of hoofbeats faded, Clara let out a slow breath. Then she looked at Gideon. "Unnecessary unpleasantness," she said. "He's polite," Gideon said. "He's furious." "Yes," Gideon agreed. "He is." He went back to the barn roof. Clara stood in the yard a little longer, watching the empty road where Crow had disappeared, and she had a feeling, the particular specific feeling she'd learned to trust after 27 years of life, that this wasn't the end of it. It was barely even the beginning. She was right. The first sign came 6 days later when she found the water in the north trough fouled with something dark and oily that had the cattle refusing to drink. Gideon drained the trough and cleaned it without comment, but his jaw was set in a way that she'd started to recognize. That evening, he walked the perimeter fence of the north pasture and came back before dark. "Anything?" she asked. "Boot prints near the trough. 2 sets, neither one of them mine or yours. They came in from the north side, which means they didn't use the road." Clara set down the pot she was holding. "That's Crow's land on the north." "I know. You think he'd actually—" "I think men who've been quietly taking what they want for years get dangerous when someone takes it back," Gideon said. "I don't think it was him. I think it was someone doing something for him that he'll never admit to." She sat down at the table. "What do we do?" "Keep our eyes open. Keep the animals in the south pasture where we can watch them easier, and we don't react." He looked at her steadily. "That's the important part. Whatever he does, we don't react in ways he can use against us. No accusations we can't prove, no confrontations that turn physical. He wants us rattled. If we're rattled, we make mistakes. If we make mistakes, he gets room to maneuver." Clara understood what he was saying, but understanding something and sitting quietly with the frustration of it were 2 different things. "You've dealt with men like Crow before." It wasn't quite a question. Gideon was quiet for a moment. "I worked for a man like him once," he said, "up in Colorado. I was younger, didn't see what he was until I was in the middle of it. He was looking at the table rather than at her. I left when I understood, should have left sooner." That was more than he'd volunteered about himself since he'd arrived, and they both seemed to notice it at the same time. He looked up and she looked away, and the moment passed without being made into anything. "I'll take the night check on the south pasture," he said. "You get some sleep." She didn't argue, which she might have a month ago. The second incident happened 11 days after Crow's visit. This one was harder to dismiss as something coincidental. 3 sections of the fence along the eastern boundary, the newly documented boundary, were cut in the night. Not broken, not damaged by weather or an animal running through. Cut. Cleanly with wire cutters in 3 separate locations spaced far enough apart to make repairs take most of a full day. They discovered it at first light when 7 head of cattle were missing from the east side count. Gideon found the cattle 3 miles east, grazing calmly on the wrong side of a ridgeline that put them technically on territory that could be described as disputed if anyone wanted to make that argument, which he suspected was exactly the point. He brought them back himself, riding out before breakfast with a rope and a jaw so tight it ached. By the time he got back, Clara had already started on the first fence section, stringing new wire with a fence stretcher and a pair of gloves that were more whole than leather. "I could have waited," he said. "No point." She didn't look up from the wire. "Hand me those staples." He handed her the staples. They worked the fence repair together for 4 hours, trading off between the wire work and the post driving, talking less than usual. The cold had come in overnight, and the wind off the hills had teeth in it. By noon, Clara's fingers were going stiff despite the gloves, and Gideon's left shoulder, old injury, he'd never explained it, had tightened up until he was favoring it, though he didn't say so, and she pretended not to notice. They ate lunch in the field, sitting on the tailgate of the wagon with cold biscuits and dried beef, because going back to the house would cost them an hour. "He's testing us," Clara said. "He is. Seeing if we'll run, or make a mistake, or give him something to take to a lawyer." She bit off a piece of dried beef with more force than was strictly necessary. "What happens when he figures out we won't?" Gideon looked out at the hills. The sky had gone the color of old pewter, which in November in this part of Texas usually meant something unpleasant was building to the north. "Then he stops testing and does something that commits him," he said. "That's when it gets serious." "This isn't serious?" "This is annoying," he said. "Serious is when he stops being careful." Clara looked at him sideways. "How are you so calm about all of this?" He thought about it genuinely, which she appreciated. He didn't give her the reflexive answer. "I'm not sure I am," he said. "I'm just calm on the outside because one of us needs to be, and you're busy keeping this operation running, which takes everything you've got. Seems like a fair division." Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at her biscuit. "That's a decent answer," she said. "Thank you," he said, and she could tell he meant it. The third week of November brought a stranger, and the stranger brought the situation into an entirely different shape. He arrived late on a Wednesday afternoon while Gideon was in town picking up supplies and Clara was alone at the property, which may or may not have been a coincidence, but she filed it away as suspicious regardless. He was younger than Crow by 20 years, with a salesman's easy manner and eyes that took inventory of everything they landed on. He said his name was Kel Barrow, and he was a land agent representing, he said, an investment group out of Fort Worth interested in frontier property acquisition. He had a card. It was a nice card. Clara looked at it and handed it back. "We're not selling," she said from the porch, where she'd positioned herself before he'd finished dismounting. "I understand that's been your position," Barrow said pleasantly. "I was just hoping to share some information about what a fair market offer might look like, given the recent—" "We're not selling," she said again. "Not to you, not to your investment group, and not to whoever is actually paying you to be here." Barrow's pleasantness didn't waver, which told her something. "Mrs. Whitlock, I assure you this is a straightforward—" "Mercer," she said. He blinked. "I'm sorry. My name is Clara Mercer now, and my husband will be back within the hour." She looked at him steadily. "When he gets here, I'll tell him you stopped by. I'm sure he'll want to hear about the investment group from Fort Worth." Barrow held her gaze for exactly as long as it took him to decide that pushing further today wasn't worth it. He touched his hat, got back on his horse, and rode out. When Gideon got back with the supplies and she told him about it, he sat on the porch steps for a while without saying anything. "Fort Worth," he said finally. That's what he said. "Crow has a brother-in-law in Fort Worth, runs a land brokerage." He looked at her. "I heard it mentioned in town last week. Didn't think much of it then." Clara leaned against the porch post. The sun was going down behind the western ridge, painting the sky in colors that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. "He's not going to stop," she said. "He's going to keep coming at us from different angles until one of them works." "Probably," Gideon agreed. "So what do we do?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We don't give him an angle that works. We make the ranch profitable enough that no debt pressure can be used against us. We keep the survey on record, and we keep the fence repaired, and we document every incident, the fouled water, the cut fence, the land agent visit, everything. We build a case brick by brick while he's trying to knock down the wall. And if he does something we can't document?" Gideon looked out at the darkening property. The south pasture, the barn, the repaired fence line, the 41 acres they'd taken back on paper, if not yet entirely in practice. "Then we deal with it," he said. "But I'd rather be ready for it before it comes." Clara nodded. She straightened up from the post and went inside because the cold was coming down fast and there was dinner to make and ledgers to review before tomorrow, and the morning would start the same as every other morning had started since Gideon Mercer had ridden up that road, and everything had gotten more complicated and somehow, for the first time in over a year, slightly less hopeless. She didn't examine that thought too closely. There were too many other things to think about, and she'd learned a long time ago that hope was the kind of thing that broke badly if you held it too tight before you'd earned it. But she held on to it a little anyway, carefully. The way you carry something fragile across a field where the ground is uneven and you can't quite see your feet, just carefully enough to keep it from falling. The cold that settled over Harmon County in late November wasn't the ordinary kind. It came down from the north without much warning. Not a gradual cooling, but a hard drop. The temperature falling 15 degrees in a single afternoon, while the sky went from gray to the particular yellowish white that old ranchers in the county recognized and didn't like. The kind of sky that meant the weather wasn't finished deciding what it was going to do, and whatever it decided wasn't going to be gentle. Gideon noticed it while he was replacing boards on the east fence line. He stopped working for a moment and looked north, and the feeling that moved through him wasn't quite dread, but it was in that neighborhood. He'd spent enough winters outdoors to know that sky. That evening at dinner, he told Clara what he was thinking. "We should move the eastern herd into the south pasture before the end of the week," he said. "The shelter's better down there if this turns into something serious." Clara looked up from the ledger she'd been reviewing while she ate, which was a habit she'd apparently had for years and wasn't about to change on account of having someone to share the table with. "It's only November." "I know." She looked at his face. He wasn't the kind of man who said things just to be saying them, and she'd learned that in the first week. If he said it twice, he meant it twice. "All right," she said. "We'll start moving them tomorrow." They spent the next 2 days shifting cattle, which was the kind of work that sounded straightforward until you were actually doing it. 134 head of mixed stock that had strong opinions about where they wanted to be and limited patience for being redirected. By the end of the second day, Gideon's shoulder was badly off again, and Clara had a gash on her forearm from a fence wire that had snapped back at her without warning. She'd wrapped it herself with a strip of cloth from the kitchen and hadn't mentioned it until Gideon saw the bandage at dinner and made her unwrap it so he could see whether it needed more attention. "It's fine," she said. "It needs to be cleaned properly." He got up and got the carbolic solution from the shelf without asking and came back to the table and cleaned the wound with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who dealt with worse and knew how these things went wrong if you ignored them. She let him do it without arguing, which surprised her slightly. She wasn't accustomed to letting people take care of things for her. She'd spent 14 months learning not to need that. "You've done this before," she said, watching him work. "Doctored a wound?" "Been careful with someone." He didn't answer immediately. He wrapped the arm with clean cloth and tied it off. "I had a younger brother," he said. "Long time ago." He didn't elaborate, and she didn't push, but the past tense sat between them with its own particular weight for the rest of the evening. The survey filing had done what Gideon expected it to do in one sense and something unexpected in another. The county recorder had confirmed the documentation was in order, and 2 neighboring landowners, men who'd dealt with Crow's boundary arguments before, had quietly told Gideon in town that they were glad someone had finally put something on record. That was the expected part. The unexpected part was how quickly word seemed to travel back to Crow himself. Within 10 days of the filing, the incidents that had been occurring at a slow, testing pace suddenly stopped. No more fouled water. No more suspicious boot prints near the fence lines. The land agent from Fort Worth didn't reappear. Crow himself hadn't been seen near the property. Clara said, "Maybe he's decided it isn't worth it." Gideon said, "Maybe." He didn't believe it. The way he figured it, a man like Crow didn't back away from something he'd invested this much quiet effort into. He regrouped. He waited for conditions to change. He found a different angle, one you weren't watching for because you'd been watching the others. So Gideon kept watching. He just didn't know yet which direction the thing would come from. It came from all directions at once, on a Thursday night in the first week of December, when the temperature dropped to 11 degrees and the wind came screaming out of the northwest like it had a grievance. Gideon woke at 3 in the morning with the specific alertness of a man whose instincts have been honed by years of sleeping in places where something could go wrong without warning. He lay still for a moment in the dark bunkhouse, listening. The wind was violent against the walls. The cold was the kind that seeped through wood and wool both. But underneath the wind he heard something that didn't belong. A sound from the eastern pasture that wasn't cattle settling or a fence post creaking. It was a different sound, multiple sounds, moving. He was dressed and out the door in under 2 minutes. The moon was 3/4 full, and the sky had gone clear after the front moved through, which meant there was enough light to see by if you knew what you were looking at. Gideon crossed the yard at a run and climbed the gate to the south pasture to look east. The eastern fence line, the one they'd repaired twice, the one that marked the newly documented boundary, was down. Not one section. Multiple sections, in a line that stretched further than he could see clearly in the moonlight. And the cattle that should have been in the south pasture were moving east through the gaps, following each other in the dumb, committed way that cattle follow each other, heading out across the disputed ground in a spreading black line. He stood there for exactly 3 seconds. Then he turned and ran back across the yard and hammered on the farmhouse door with the flat of his hand. "Clara!" He didn't shout, but his voice carried. "Clara, get up, get dressed, get your coat and your boots. Now!" The door opened faster than he expected. She was already half awake. The wind had been keeping her up, and she read his face in the moonlight without needing an explanation. "The fence," she said. "Multiple sections down on the east line. The herd's moving through." She was back in 30 seconds with her coat and boots on. She didn't ask how bad it was or whether they should wait for daylight or any of the other questions that fear generates. She just said, I'll get the horses, and went. They rode out into 11-degree wind with nothing but moonlight and the sound of cattle moving in the wrong direction, and the knowledge, unspoken but present between them like a third rider, that this was no accident. Wire cutters made a clean cut. 3 weeks of quiet from Crow had not been retreat. It had been preparation. Gideon rode the fence line while Clara circled ahead to try to slow the lead cattle before they spread further east. The damage was worse than he'd initially estimated. 6 sections down, each one cut cleanly, spaced to create the longest possible gap in the shortest period of repair time. Whoever had done it knew what they were doing and had done it fast, which meant they'd known the fence layout in advance and had probably walked it in daylight to plan. He found the first rider near the third gap. The man was on horseback at the edge of the cleared ground, sitting still, watching the cattle move through. He wasn't making any effort to push the animals, just watching. Documenting, Gideon realized. Building a record of Whitlock cattle on disputed ground. Someone would claim in the morning that the Mercer cattle had been grazing illegally on Crow territory, and there'd be a witness to swear to it. Gideon rode toward him at a controlled pace. He didn't draw the rifle he had in the saddle scabbard. He just rode up to within 10 yards and stopped. The man was young, mid-20s, with a kerchief pulled up over his nose against the cold. He hadn't expected to be approached. His horse shifted nervously. "You're not on Crow land," Gideon said. His voice was completely level. "You're on Mercer land. Survey filed with Harmon County, December 2nd. You want to tell Crow that whatever he paid you for tonight isn't going to accomplish what he told you it would." The rider said nothing, but his horse kept moving sideways, which meant its rider's legs were tense. "I'm going to ask you something," Gideon said, "and I want you to think carefully before you decide how you want the rest of this night to go. Do you own land?" A pause, then, grudgingly, "My family does, small place north of here." "Then you understand what it is to have someone try to take something your family built." Gideon looked at him steadily across the cold distance between them. "I'm not going to pull this rifle. I'm not going to chase you. I'm going to round up my cattle and repair my fence and file a report of fence sabotage with the county sheriff in the morning with the names of any witnesses I can identify." He paused. "You might want to think about whether Crow's money is worth having your name on that report." The rider looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned his horse and rode north without a word. Gideon sat still in the freezing wind and let out a breath that fogged thick in the cold air. Then he turned and went to find Clara. She'd managed to stop the leading edge of the herd about a quarter-mile east of the last fence gap, not a small thing to do alone in the dark on a horse that was increasingly unhappy about the wind and the cold. She'd gotten herself and her horse in front of the leaders and just stayed there, blocking, redirecting, refusing to let them go further, which was pure stubbornness as a ranching technique, but it worked when nothing else was available. When Gideon rode up, she was still holding position, and her face in the moonlight was white with cold and tight, with something that was either fury or determination or both, which in Clara's case were often hard to tell apart. "How many?" she called. "At least 60 through the gaps. Could be more." He pulled up beside her. "There were riders. At least one I saw. I think they were planning to report our cattle on their ground in the morning." Her expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes went very still. "Were. One's gone. I don't know how many others there were." He looked out at the dark expanse of ground ahead of them, where the cattle had settled temporarily because there was nothing driving them further. "We need to get them back before daylight. If there's still a witness out there in the morning with a story about our cattle being east of the boundary, we need the cattle to already be back on our land." Clara looked at the scattered herd spread across the moonlit ground, and she made the same kind of fast, unflinching calculation she'd been making since she'd been running this place alone. What's actually possible? What has to be done? What order do you do it in when there's no good option? Only less bad ones. "You take the east flank," she said. "I'll push from the north. We drive them back through the gaps and straight to the south pasture. In this wind, at this temperature, in the dark." "Yes." "All right," he said, and they split apart. What followed was 2.5 hours of the hardest, coldest, most physically brutal work Gideon could remember doing, and he'd done hard work in bad conditions most of his adult life. The cattle didn't want to move back the direction they'd come from because cattle never want to do that. They have strong opinions about forward and essentially no concept of reverse. The wind made the horses miserable, and the horses communicated their misery constantly. The cold had gotten worse as the night went on, and Gideon's hands inside his gloves had gone past cold into that specific numbness that stops feeling like temperature and starts feeling like absence. He fell off his horse once, not dramatically. The horse stumbled in a hole that neither of them saw in the moonlight shadow, and Gideon went sideways and hit the frozen ground with his left shoulder, the bad one, and lay there for a second looking at the sky while the pain lit up white and complete from shoulder to fingertips. He got up, got back on the horse, kept moving. Clara didn't see it happen, and he didn't tell her. By the time the eastern horizon had gone from black to the deep gray that precedes dawn, they had all but 11 of the scattered cattle back through the fence gaps and into the south pasture. The 11 that remained were spread across a half-mile radius and would require daylight to locate properly. Gideon and Clara stood their horses at the broken fence line, with steam rising off the animals and their own breath clouding around them, and looked at what was left to do. "We're short 11, Gideon said. His voice came out rougher than usual. "We'll find them at first light." Clara nodded. Her face had gone past the white of cold into something more complicated, exhaustion and anger, and something she was working not to let become despair. Her hair had come loose from its braid at some point in the night and was blowing across her face, and she kept pushing it back with a hand that was shaking slightly, and she either didn't notice or didn't have the energy to care. "The fence," she said. "Tomorrow. It'll take most of the day." "Third time." "Third time," he agreed. She was quiet for a moment. The wind was still blowing, but it had dropped a few degrees in force, the way wind sometimes does just before dawn, as if it's taking a breath before starting again. In the growing gray light, Gideon could see the ranch house in the distance, the lamp that Clara had left burning in the kitchen window, the barn with its weather vane pointing due north, the fence posts that needed painting and the yard that needed clearing, and the 100 other things that needed doing and would need doing again after they were done and would go on needing doing indefinitely. "He's not going to stop," Clara said. It wasn't a new thought. She'd said it before, but it had a different weight now, out here in the freezing dark after a night that had taken everything they had. "No," Gideon said. "He's not." "Then what do we do that we haven't done?" Gideon looked at the fence gaps, 6 sections of wire cut clean, steel cold as bone in the gray light. He thought about the rider he'd confronted in the dark and the calculation he'd seen the man make, the quiet arithmetic of a hired hand deciding whether his employer's interests were worth his own risk. He thought about the county sheriff, a man named Aldridge who he'd spoken to twice and assessed as honest but cautious, the kind of man who moved carefully and followed evidence. "We go to Aldridge in the morning," he said, "not with suspicion, with documentation. The cut fence, the incident dates, the land agent visit, the fouled water, all of it. We lay it in front of him as a pattern. Like this is a war of attrition. Make life hard enough for long enough that we give up or make a mistake. But if he's suddenly looking at a legal claim for 3 years of unpaid grazing on land he knew belonged to us, that's a different kind of exposure." Gideon looked at her steadily. "Men like Crow protect their money first. If this becomes a threat to his money rather than just pressure on ours, he might decide the cost of continuing isn't worth it." Clara was quiet for a long time. A cow complained somewhere in the south pasture. The sky had gone from gray to pale gold at the eastern edge, and the first actual light was beginning to separate the dark shapes of the land from the dark shapes of the sky. "You thought of all this tonight?" she said. "I thought of the grazing claim a few weeks ago," he said. "I didn't want to say it until I was sure we had enough on record to make it credible." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite categorize. Not gratitude exactly, because Clara wasn't a woman who wore gratitude openly, but something close to it, filtered through the specific pragmatism of a person who has learned to evaluate people by what they do rather than what they say. "Let's go find the 11 head," she said. They found 9 of them before the sun was fully up, scattered along a dry creek bed about a half-mile northeast, standing around looking placidly resentful about the cold. The other 2 took until almost noon, located in a shallow coulee where they'd apparently decided the wind was slightly less terrible and had committed to staying there regardless of Gideon's opinions on the matter. By the time the last animal was back in the south pasture and the pasture gate was secured, Gideon's shoulder had stiffened to the point where his left arm was functionally useless above chest height, and Clara had stopped mentioning that she was fine when he looked at her, which meant she wasn't. They ate lunch standing at the kitchen counter because sitting down felt like a commitment neither of them could afford, as if the body, once horizontal, might decide it was finished for the day and refuse to negotiate. Clara made coffee so strong it was nearly offensive, and they both drank it without comment. "I'll ride to Aldridge this afternoon," Gideon said. "Your shoulder is fine." It wasn't, but riding didn't require the shoulder in the same way fence work did, and the sheriff's office wasn't going to come to them. Clara looked at him long enough to make it clear she didn't believe him. Then she said, "I'll write everything down, the dates, the incidents, the descriptions, all of it in order. You can take it with you." That would help. She got the paper and ink from the desk in the corner and sat down and started writing, and Gideon took his coffee to the window and looked out at the property in the pale winter light. The south pasture with the cattle settled and accounted for, the east fence that needed repairing again, the 41 acres on the other side of it that were theirs on paper and had been bled for in practice. His shoulder hurt badly. His hands were still not entirely back to feeling like his own. He was tired in the deep way that rest only partially fixes, the kind of tired that accumulates over weeks of hard work and poor sleep and constant low-grade alertness. But he looked at the ranch, and he felt something that had been growing for weeks without his exactly noticing it. A specific, stubborn attachment to a piece of ground that had started as someone else's problem and had become, without any formal announcement, something he thought of as his. He hadn't said that to Clara. He wasn't sure how to say it, or whether it was the right time, or whether she'd want to hear it. There were too many other things between them that still went unspoken. The arrangement they'd entered, the terms that had made sense in the beginning and now sat slightly sideways, like a door that had been hung on hinges built for a different frame. He didn't examine it too closely. There was too much else to do, and the fence wasn't going to repair itself, and Crow hadn't played his last hand yet. Clara slid the written account across the table without looking up from the final sentence she was finishing. "There," she said. He picked it up and read it through. She'd organized it clearly, in plain language, with dates and descriptions that were specific without being inflammatory. It was exactly right, the record of a reasonable person carefully documenting an escalating situation rather than the record of a frightened person making accusations. "This is good," he said. "I know." She said it without arrogance, just the flat confidence of someone who'd been managing complex situations alone for over a year and knew what competence looked like when she produced it. He folded the document carefully and put it inside his coat. Then he went to saddle his horse. The ride to town hurt more than he'd told her it would, the cold pressing on the shoulder injury in a way that made the miles feel longer. He didn't stop or slow down. He thought about 6 cut fence sections and 60 head of cattle driven through in the dark, and a man on horseback sitting in the cold watching it happen. And the thought did what bad thoughts sometimes do in sufficient quantities. It steadied him, because anger focused in the right direction was a better fuel than exhaustion. He reached Aldridge's office before dark and laid the documentation on the man's desk and told him the story from the beginning, calmly and in sequence, without editorializing. Aldridge listened without interrupting, which Gideon took as a sign of seriousness rather than indifference. When it was done, the sheriff sat back in his chair and looked at the papers for a long time. "I can't prove Crow ordered it," Aldridge said. "I know that. But I can open an investigation into the fence sabotage. That's a criminal offense, regardless of who ordered it." "That's all I'm asking." Aldridge looked at him. "You understand that opening an investigation into Silas Crow in this county is going to create a certain amount of friction?" "Yes," Gideon said. "I imagine it will." The sheriff nodded slowly, with the expression of a man accepting something he'd known was going to land on his desk eventually. He picked up the document. "I'll start with the fence damage. You file a formal complaint, and I'll ride out to look at the cuts myself." "Tomorrow morning?" "Tomorrow morning." Gideon rode home in the dark, which was not a pleasant ride, but was a necessary one. When he got back, the kitchen lamp was lit, and Clara was at the table with the ledgers again. Because that was Clara. There was always something else to address, always another number to reckon with, always one more thing that needed to be faced before she'd let herself stop. She looked up when he came through the door. "Aldridge is opening an investigation," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. "Good," she said. He hung up his coat and washed his hands at the basin and sat down across from her, and she poured him the coffee that had been keeping warm on the stove, and they sat together at the table in the lamplight with the wind pushing at the walls outside, and the herd settled in the south pasture, and 41 acres of their own ground sitting in the cold dark to the east, waiting. Neither of them knew yet what was coming, the kind of winter that doesn't announce itself, that arrives like a verdict and stays like a sentence. But for that one evening, in that kitchen, with the accounts slightly more in their favor than they'd been the day before, it was enough to simply be still for a while. It didn't last long. It never did. But it was real, and they'd earned it, and that was more than nothing. Sheriff Aldridge rode out the following morning as promised, arriving just after sunrise with a deputy named Cass, who was young enough that his beard was still working out its intentions. They walked the eastern fence line with Gideon and looked at the cut sections with the careful attention of men whose job required them to look carefully at things before deciding what to think about them. Aldridge crouched at the third gap and examined the wire end closest to the post. The cut was clean. Not a break, not a stretch, a cut. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at it the way he'd looked at the documents the night before, with the patient, unhurried attention of a man who understood that conclusions reached quickly were often conclusions that had to be unreached later at significant cost. Wire cutters, Cass said, which was obvious, but young deputies often felt the need to establish that they'd noticed the obvious things before moving on to the less obvious ones. "Wire cutters," Aldridge confirmed and stood up. He looked east across the boundary ground, then back at Gideon. "How many sections total?" "6, spaced out along a quarter-mile of the line." "Spaced out," Aldridge repeated that slowly. "Not one incident, a coordinated one." "That's how I read it." The sheriff nodded once, the way men nod when something they already suspected has been confirmed for them. He filed the formal incident report before he rode back to town, and he told Gideon he'd be making some inquiries, and his face when he said it had the particular quality of a man who already had a fairly good idea where those inquiries would lead and was preparing himself for the friction that would result. True to what Gideon had said to Clara, the investigation's existence, not even its findings, just the fact of it, changed something in the air around the situation. Word traveled in small counties the way weather traveled across open land, without any particular effort, simply as a function of how these things moved. Within a week, 2 men in town had separately mentioned to Gideon that Silas Crow had been seen in conversation with his lawyer for 2 consecutive afternoons. A third man, who ran the feed store and made it his business to know everyone else's, told Clara while she was buying grain that Crow had canceled a planned trip to Fort Worth. "Means he's watching something close to home," Gideon said when she told him. "Or he's talking to his lawyer about the grazing claim." Clara set the grain sacks down in the barn and straightened up. "Did you write to Austin?" "Letter went out 3 days ago." He'd paid for the letter and the potential consultation fee out of his own wages without telling her, because telling her would have required a conversation about the wages that he wasn't ready to have yet. "If they respond, we'll know more about what we're working with legally." Clara looked at him with the expression she occasionally wore when she suspected he'd done something she hadn't asked him to do and wasn't sure how to feel about it. Then she picked up the second grain sack and carried it to the feed bin, and that was that. They were 4 days into December, and the fence had been repaired for the 3rd time, and the herd was holding steady in the south pasture when the blizzard arrived. It didn't announce itself with much drama. The temperature had been dropping for 2 days, steady and purposeful, and the sky had gone that same yellowish-white that Gideon had noticed in November, and trusted correctly then. But the scale of what came down on that Thursday afternoon was different from anything the temperature drop had suggested. The first snow started at noon, light, almost dainty, the kind that could pass for an ordinary winter day. By 3 in the afternoon, visibility had dropped to 30 yards. By 5, it was less than 10. The wind came with it. That was the part that turned a hard snowstorm into something genuinely dangerous. Not the snow itself, but the wind driving it horizontal, finding every gap in a barn wall, every poorly fitted door frame, every fence post that hadn't been set quite deep enough. The temperature by nightfall was below 0, and not modestly. Gideon and Clara both understood within the first hour what this was going to be. They didn't discuss it at length because there wasn't time for discussion. They moved. The cattle in the south pasture needed to be pushed into the barn and the adjacent covered lot, all 134 head into a space designed for comfortable accommodation of perhaps 80. It was going to be crowded and loud, and the cattle were going to resist because cattle resist everything that requires them to do something they weren't already planning to do, and a blizzard doesn't change that fundamental characteristic of cattle. It took 3 hours in the dark and the screaming wind to get them in, and those 3 hours were the kind that rewrite a person's understanding of what their body can actually do when the alternative is watching animals die. Clara fell twice. Once when a steer knocked her sideways into the fence rail, once when the ground under her boot was ice, and she had no warning. She got up both times before Gideon could reach her and waved him off with the impatience of someone who has no time for being checked on. He fell once himself, harder than she had, when a panicked heifer ran directly into him from behind, and he went face first into the frozen mud and lay there for a second with the heifer stepping over him and the wind screaming overhead. He had a split lip when he got up. He wiped it on his sleeve and kept moving. By the time the last animal was in and the barn doors were hauled shut against the wind and secured with the heavy timber bar, both of them were soaked through and shaking in ways that weren't entirely from cold. They stood in the relative shelter of the barn with the body heat of over 100 animals creating something almost warm, listening to the storm outside trying to get in. "Water," Gideon said. He was breathing hard. "The north trough will be frozen solid by morning." Clara's voice was hoarse. "The barn line should still be running, but if it freezes in the wall overnight, I'll check it every 2 hours. "We'll check it every 2 hours, she said, which was how she corrected him when he said something that implied she wouldn't be part of a task. They went to the house and changed into dry clothes, separately, in their respective spaces, with the specific careful privacy they'd maintained from the beginning without discussing it. Clara made soup from whatever was at hand, because hot food was necessary, and she made it fast and didn't make a production of it. They ate at the table with the sound of the blizzard battering every outside surface of the house, and the lamp flame shivering when the wind found a gap somewhere in the wall. "How long do you think it lasts?" Clara asked. Gideon looked at the window, which was opaque with snow pressed against the glass. "Can't know for certain. If the front is moving, 2 days. If it stalls..." He shook his head. "Could be longer." It stalled. The blizzard sat over Harmon County for 4 days. 4 days in which the temperature did not rise above 5 degrees, in which the wind did not drop below 30 miles an hour for any sustained period, in which the snow accumulated until the fence posts were half buried and the wagon in the yard disappeared under a white shape that only vaguely suggested what it had been. Those 4 days, and the weeks that followed as the cold held and the world stayed frozen and hard, were the period that would define everything that came after. Not because of any single dramatic event, but because of the relentless accumulation of small, difficult, necessary things done over and over in conditions that made all of them harder. Every 2 hours through every night, one of them pulled on everything they owned and went to the barn to check the water line and the animals. They took turns, but not always in the strict rotation they'd started with, because sometimes one of them woke before the other and let the other sleep, and neither of them commented on this when it happened. The barn became a place they knew, the way you know rooms in a house you've lived in for years, which board squeaked, which corner the wind found first, which stall the oldest cow preferred and would return to no matter how many times she was moved. On the second night, they found 3 newborn calves that hadn't been anticipated. A cow that had been further along than her condition suggested had dropped them sometime in the late afternoon, in the cold, in the crowded barn, because cattle operate on their own schedule, and a blizzard is not a compelling argument for rescheduling. 2 of the calves were standing and nursing. The third was on the ground, too cold to rise, its breathing shallow and labored. Clara was on the 2 a.m. check when she found them. She didn't come back to the house. She sent Gideon back to get the spare blankets from the bunkhouse chest and stayed in the barn herself, pulling the third calf into her lap and wrapping it in her coat, using the warmth of her own body because that was what the situation required, and there wasn't a more sophisticated solution available at 2 in the morning in a blizzard. When Gideon came back with the blankets and found her sitting on the barn floor with a newborn calf in her lap, and her coat wrapped around both of them. He didn't say anything. He spread the blankets around her and the calf both, and went to check the water line, which had partly frozen at the junction, and spent 40 minutes thawing it with hot water he carried from the house in a covered pot, making 3 trips to get enough. By 4 in the morning, the calf was standing, unsteadily, on legs that weren't entirely sure what they were for yet, but standing. Clara sat on the barn floor with her back against the stall wall and watched it find its mother, and watched its mother accept it with the particular flat patience that cows bring to most of life's situations. And she was so tired that the emotion she felt about it came through without her usual defenses. Just open relief, uncomplicated, and genuine. Gideon came back from the waterline and saw her face and sat down on the floor beside her without saying anything, and they stayed like that for a few minutes in the warm, crowded dark of the barn with the storm going on outside. And something shifted in the space between them that neither of them named but both of them felt. "We should go back in," Gideon said eventually. "We should," Clara agreed, and neither of them moved for another few minutes. The blizzard broke on the morning of the 5th day. The wind dropped first, then the sky cleared from the west, and the world outside was white and still and searingly cold in the windless air. The snow was 3 feet deep in the open and drifted to 6 and 8 against any surface that had given the wind something to push against. They spent 2 full days just uncovering things, digging out the barn doors that had drifted over, clearing the path to the water pump, locating the fencing they'd need to repair once the ground could be reached. The wagon had to be dug out by hand, which took most of one afternoon. The chicken coop had partially collapsed under the snow weight, and the 6 chickens inside had survived by what could only be described as determined stubbornness, all of them alive and deeply offended when the roof was cleared and light got in again. But the county around them had not fared as well. Word came in pieces as the roads became passable, and people began to move again. Neighbors they knew had lost animals, in some cases significant portions of their herds. A ranch 12 miles north had lost their entire calf crop. 2 operations to the east had lost older cattle, the ones that couldn't take the sustained cold, their carcasses found in the fields when the snow retreated enough to reveal them. Jed Hallett, who ran a mid-sized operation bordering theirs to the south, rode over in the second week after the storm to check his fence line and stopped at the Mercer yard looking like a man who had aged several years in 2 weeks. He was 53 and had been ranching this county his whole life, and he looked at the barn that was still standing and the herd that was accounted for, and he said to Gideon, without any particular expression, "How many did you lose?" 4 head, Gideon said. 3 older animals and 1 calf we couldn't save. Hallett looked at him for a long moment. "We lost 31. Gideon didn't say anything. There wasn't much to say to that. "You moved early," Hallett said. "Before the storm. I heard you were moving your herd south a full week before it hit." "The sky looked wrong," Gideon said. Hallett nodded slowly. "The sky looked wrong," he repeated, as if filing that observation somewhere for future use. "I'll tell you, Mercer, most of the county is going to be counting losses for months. You two are going to be one of the only operations that comes out of this winter with a working herd intact." After Hallett left, Claire came out of the house where she'd been listening from the porch. 4 head, she said quietly. 4 is bad, Gideon said. 4 is not catastrophic. She nodded. She'd done the math herself. They both had. 4 animals against a herd of 134 was a survivable loss. Painful, but survivable. The winter wasn't over, and they knew that, but they'd taken the first and worst hit and were still standing. What they didn't know yet was that the blizzard had been the opening move of the hardest winter in a generation, and it wasn't finished. January came in cold and stayed cold. Temperatures that should have moderated stayed locked below freezing for 2 and 3 weeks at a stretch, the kind of sustained cold that drains reserves steadily, of feed, of firewood, of the physical and emotional stamina that makes it possible to keep going when everything feels like it's working against you. The hay supply that had seemed adequate in October was running low by mid-January, which forced a decision. Buy more at prices inflated by the winter scarcity, or begin reducing the herd strategically to lower the feed demand. They talked about it at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening, actually talked about it, with the ledgers open and the figures in front of them, The way two people talk about a shared problem when they've stopped approaching each situation as separate parties with separate interests. If we sell 15 head now before conditions worsen, Claire started. We get below market price because everyone in the county is trying to sell and no one is buying, Gideon said. We've already seen that. Hallett said the stockyards are turning people away. So we buy more hay at twice the normal price, which we can cover if the refinancing term holds, and we don't have any other large expenses in the next 60 days. She looked at the ledger. Can we hold that? Gideon looked at the same figures. If nothing else breaks and we don't lose more cattle, those are two conditions I can't guarantee. No, he said, but they're the best conditions we've got. She tapped her pen on the ledger. It was a habit she had when she was thinking, not anxious tapping, but rhythmic and focused, like she was counting something. Buy the hay, she said finally. We sell now. We lose animals, we'll spend 2 years rebuilding. We hold through winter. We come out with a viable herd in spring. Agreed, Gideon said. He rode to 3 different suppliers before he found one who had adequate supply and was willing to deal at a price that wasn't entirely predatory. A man named Sutter, 30 miles away, who had put up more hay than usual the previous summer out of a general suspicion that the winter would be bad, and was now finding himself with valuable inventory and enough decency not to extract every last dollar available from the people who needed it. The hay cost them more than it should have. Everything cost more than it should have that winter. Firewood, lamp oil, the carbolic solution for the wound on Clara's arm that had reopened when she caught it on a nail in the barn and refused to fully heal in the cold. Small costs stacking up against a budget that had no slack. Gideon started doing things he didn't mention to Clara. Not deceptive things, just quiet adjustments. He'd been putting his wages into the ranch account rather than keeping them, a decision he'd made gradually and without a formal announcement, because announcing it would have made Clara uncomfortable and the money was more useful where it was. He fixed things around the property on his own time that weren't strictly his responsibility. A section of roof on the bunkhouse, the hinge on the root cellar door that had been loose since before he'd arrived, the seat on the porch that would eventually give way under anyone who sat on it with any confidence. He wasn't sure why he did these things exactly, or rather he was sure but hadn't settled yet on what that certainty meant for the arrangement they were in. Clara noticed. Of course she did. She noticed everything on her property. She didn't say anything directly, but she started leaving coffee on the stove later in the evenings, later than she needed to for herself. And once, without comment, she brought a second blanket to the bunkhouse and hung it on the hook inside the door, because January nights in an uninsulated bunkhouse were a specific kind of cold that no working person should have to just accept. In the 3rd week of January, Gideon's shoulder gave out completely. It had been building for weeks, since the night of the fence cutting, when he'd fallen on it, and through every cold morning and every physical demand that winter required. He'd been managing it with the particular determined minimization that men apply to injuries when stopping to deal with them properly feels impossible. But on a Tuesday morning, when he reached up to pull a hay bale from the upper stack in the barn, something in the shoulder moved in a direction it absolutely was not meant to move, and the pain that followed was the kind that drops you. He didn't drop. He put his hand against the barn wall and breathed and waited for the worst of it to pass, which took longer than he would have liked. When he straightened up, Clara was in the barn doorway. I heard you, she said. I'm fine. That's what I said about my arm, she said. Come inside. There's still Gideon. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had a quality he'd learned to recognize, a finality that wasn't harsh but wasn't open to debate either. Come inside. He came inside. She made him take off his shirt, which he did with the stiff, slightly self-conscious air of a man who was more accustomed to privacy than to being cared for, and she examined the shoulder with both hands, carefully, systematically, following the bone and the muscle the way someone does who has treated enough injuries to know where to press and where not to. You need to not use this for a week, she said. We can't afford... Gideon. Same voice, same quality. A week of limited use now or permanent damage later. I have seen what happens when men refuse to let something heal. My husband's neighbor lost the use of his arm entirely because he wouldn't rest a shoulder injury. He was 41 years old. He was quiet. I can carry the barn work for a week, she said, The cattle don't require heavy lifting right now. You can manage the accounts, the feed calculations, the correspondence with the Austin lawyer. She met his eyes. 1 week. He looked at her. At the practical certainty in her face, the same quality that had convinced him to say yes to a marriage proposal from a woman he'd never met, standing on a porch with mud on his boots and nowhere in particular to be. "All right," he said. 1 week. She made a sling from a strip of canvas and fashioned it without wasted movement, tying it off in a way that was efficient and not especially gentle, but completely effective. And the whole time her hands were working, she was concentrating on the task with total focus, the way she concentrated on everything. And Gideon sat still and let her do it, and thought about the fact that he had spent 6 years moving from one place to another, telling himself he was looking for something without ever quite knowing what it was. It occurred to him, sitting in that kitchen with a canvas sling being tied around his shoulder, that he might have found it. He didn't say that. The timing was wrong, and the thought was too large for the room, and there was too much still uncertain between them. But he thought it, and the thinking of it settled something in him that had been restless for a long time. Clara tied off the sling and stepped back and looked at her work. "Rest it," she said. "I'll rest it," he said. She picked up the hay hook from the table where he'd set it down and went back to the barn, because there was still work to do and she was the only one who could do it for the next week. And Clara Whitlock, Clara Mercer, did not wait for things to be easier before starting them. Gideon watched her go from the kitchen window. The winter was still outside, hard and cold and nowhere near finished. The herd was alive. The fence was intact. The survey was on record. The lawyer in Austin had written back with language that made Crow's grazing claim exposure sound both viable and significant. And in 2 months, or 3, or however long this winter decided to last, there would be spring on the other side of it. He opened the account ledger and picked up his pen and got to work. February came in the same way January had ended, cold, unrelenting, and indifferent to whatever plans people had made around it. The shoulder healed slowly, the way injuries heal in winter when the body is spending most of its resources on staying warm rather than repairs. Gideon used the sling for the week Clara had demanded, then quietly stopped using it while still being careful with the arm, which was a compromise he reached with himself without consulting her. She noticed he'd stopped using it. She didn't say anything, which he understood to mean she'd decided the shoulder looked functional enough that she wasn't going to fight that particular battle again. They had developed over 4 months of shared difficulty, a specific and unspoken grammar of when to push and when to let things go. It wasn't a perfect system. There were evenings when the exhaustion and the cold and the sustained pressure of everything made one or both of them shorter than they meant to be. A clipped response at dinner, a silence that lasted longer than it should, the particular friction that comes from 2 people working in close quarters through hard circumstances and trying not to take the hard circumstances out on each other. They didn't always succeed, but they tried, and the trying was visible to both of them, and that counted for something. The letter from the Austin lawyer arrived on a Thursday in the second week of February. His name was Gareth Hollis, and he was, by the evidence of his writing, a precise and careful man who chose words with the specific intention of saying exactly what he meant and nothing more. The letter laid out the legal framework for a grazing compensation claim in terms that were measured but not timid. 3 years of undocumented use of 41 acres of documented Mercer land at prevailing grazing rates for the region produced a figure that made Clara sit down when she read it. "This number," she said, pointing at the page. "I know," Gideon said. "That's not a small amount of money." "No, it's not." She looked at him. "Did you know it would be this much when you suggested this?" "I had an estimate," he said. "The actual figure is higher than I calculated." He sat down across from her. "Hollis says it's a solid claim. The survey documentation is clean, the filing date is clear, and the 3-year duration works in our favor because it establishes a pattern rather than a single incident." Clara set the letter down and looked at the kitchen wall for a moment, the way she did when she was thinking through something she hadn't finished thinking through yet. "Crow will fight it," she said. "He'll think about fighting it," Gideon said, "and then he'll look at what it costs to fight it versus what it costs to settle, and he'll do the arithmetic that men like him always do." "You're more confident about that than I am." "Because I've watched him operate since October," Gideon said. "He's not sentimental about money. He doesn't fight battles he can't win cheaply. The investigation Aldridge opened is still active, which means anything that goes to court opens him up to scrutiny he doesn't want. He looked at her steadily. The fence cutting, the fouled water, the land agent, all of it is documented. If this goes to a judge, those documents go with it. Clara picked up the letter again. Read it through a second time more slowly. What do you recommend? It was a question she'd asked him before, in various forms, over the months they'd been working together. It still meant something to him that she asked it, not because she couldn't reach her own conclusions, but because she'd decided his judgment was worth consulting, and that wasn't a thing Clara Mercer gave away without reason. I recommend we send Hollis's assessment to Crow's lawyer directly, Gideon said. No confrontation, no ultimatum, just the document. Let him read the numbers and make his own arithmetic. The response came back in 11 days. Not from Crow directly. Men like Crow didn't write letters that could be read later in courtrooms, but from his lawyer, in careful language that managed to suggest a willingness to discuss a mutually agreeable resolution without technically admitting that any resolution was needed. Gideon read it, handed it to Clara, and watched her read it. He wants to negotiate, she said. He wants us to think he's doing us a favor by negotiating, Gideon said. Which is fine. We don't need him to admit what it actually is. The negotiation took 3 weeks and happened entirely through lawyers, which was slower and more expensive than a direct conversation would have been, but considerably safer given everything that had already happened. Hollis handled it from Austin with the unhurried firmness of a man who knew his position was strong and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Crow's lawyer pushed back on the grazing rate calculation and disputed 2 of the 3 years on technical grounds that Hollis dismantled point by point in writing. In the end, Silas Crow paid a settlement figure that was lower than Hollis's initial calculation, but high enough that when Gideon showed Clara the final number, she had to get up and walk to the window and stand there for a minute with her back to him. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes." Her voice was steady. "I just need a moment." He gave her the moment. Outside the window, the February world was still frozen and gray, but there were signs in it, the subtle signs you learn to read only after enough winters, that it was thinking about ending. The quality of the light was changing. Not warm yet, not even close, but different from January's light, less final. When she turned back around, her eyes were dry. She'd cried twice in the months he'd known her, once in the barn at 3 a.m. over the calf that had been too cold, when she thought he was asleep, and once in late January when a letter had come from her brother in Austin that she hadn't shared with him but had left her quiet for 2 days afterward. Both times she'd handled it by herself in private, the way she handled most things that got past her defenses. He'd learned not to reach for those moments. She didn't want to be witnessed in them. That was her right. "The debt," she said. "With this settlement, we can clear the remaining debt on the property." "Yes," he said, "with enough left to rebuild the hay reserve and make it through to spring selling season." She looked at him. "You've already run the numbers." "Last night," he said. "I didn't want to show you the settlement figure without knowing what it meant on the other side of it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You've been putting your wages into the account." He went still. "Clara, don't." She said it without heat, just firmly. "I found it when I was doing the February reconciliation. Your wages are in the account, and they've been there since at least December." She looked at him directly, and there was something in her expression that he couldn't entirely interpret. Not anger, not exactly, but something complex enough that it required her full face to contain it. "Why?" He took a breath. "Because it made more sense for them to be there than anywhere else. The ranch needed the capital more than I needed the cash." "That's not an answer." He looked at her. She was right. It wasn't an answer. It was the practical explanation, which was different from the actual one. "I stopped thinking of this as your problem a long time ago," he said. "I'm not sure when exactly. Somewhere around the time I was lying on frozen ground at 3 a.m. while a heifer stepped over me." He paused. "It's my problem too, that's all." The kitchen was very quiet. "Gideon," she said. Then she stopped. "You don't have to say anything," he said. This isn't a presentation of some kind. I'm just being honest about how I've been thinking." She looked at him for a long moment with the particular careful quality of attention she brought to things that mattered. When we drew up the arrangement, she said slowly, I told you we could dissolve it quietly when the ranch was stable. You did. The ranch is going to be stable. In spring, when the debt is cleared and the herd is rebuilt, the reason we married stops applying. She held his gaze. I need you to tell me honestly what you want, not what's practical. What you want. He didn't look away. I want to stay, he said. Not under the arrangement, not as a hired hand with a convenient last name. I want to stay because this place has become mine, in the only way a place ever really becomes yours. Because I've bled for it, and frozen for it, and fought for it, and so have you, and the two things aren't separate anymore in my head. The silence that followed lasted long enough to be uncomfortable, and he let it, because he'd said what he'd meant to say, and pressuring her to respond faster than she was ready to would have cheapened it. Clara looked at the table, at the ledger book she'd been keeping since before he arrived, at the window. Then she looked back at him. I was going to ask you to leave, she said, after the debt was settled. I had the conversation prepared in my head, thanking you, the wages, making it clean. She was quiet for a second. I kept putting it off. Why? She made a short sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Because every time I thought I was going to have it, you did something else, fixed something else. Or you said the right thing to Aldridge, or you knew what to do with the cattle in the dark, or you sat on a barn floor at 4 a.m. and didn't make a sound while I was trying not to fall apart over a calf. She shook her head slightly. You kept making it impossible to want you gone. That was mostly accidental, he said. I know. This time it was a real laugh, brief and genuine, and it broke something loose in the room that had been tight for too long. That's the part that convinced me. Spring did not arrive all at once. It never does. It came in pieces. A day in early March where the temperature climbed above 40 for the first time in months, then dropped again the following night. Patches of mud appearing along the south fence where the snow pulled back. The cattle beginning to move differently in the pasture, with less of the conserving stillness of cold weather survival and more of the restless energy of animals that sense something changing. The creek on the eastern boundary thawed from the center outward, which was how Gideon knew the worst of it was over. The bank visit to finalize the debt clearance happened on a Wednesday in late March. Douglas Harder, the loan officer who had looked at them with such careful skepticism on their first visit, stamped the payoff document with an expression that was impossible to read. Not warm, not unfriendly, simply the expression of a man completing a transaction that had gone differently than he'd expected. Paid in full, he said, sliding the stamped certificate across the desk. Clara picked it up. She looked at it for exactly 3 seconds. Then she folded it, put it in her coat pocket, and stood up. Thank you, Mr. Harder. Outside on the street in the March air, cool but not cold, the first genuinely not cold air in 4 months, she stopped walking and stood still on the boardwalk for a moment. Gideon stopped beside her. It's done, she said. It is. She exhaled long and slow, the same way she'd exhaled when he came back with the survey filing receipt in November. Some things in life you build up to for so long that when they finally arrive, the body needs a moment to accept that the bracing is no longer necessary. He gave her the moment. In April, they rode the full eastern boundary together for the first time without urgency. Not to check a fence, or document an incident, or respond to something that had gone wrong, just to ride it. The 41 acres that had been disputed were greening up well. The grass that Crow's cattle had grazed for 3 years was recovering with the particular resilience that good pasture land shows when given the chance, slowly and without drama, but steadily. We should move 12 head out here in May, Gideon said, looking at the grass. Not too many to start. 14, Clara said. The grass can handle it if we rotate them. 14 then. They sat their horses at the easternmost boundary point, the one Price had established with his transit level and his careful notebook, and looked out at the land that was theirs on paper and in practice now, both things aligned at last. Edmund Price saved this ranch, Clara said. Price did his job, Gideon said. You saved this ranch. You were saving it before I rode up that road. She looked at him sideways. I was losing it before you rode up that road. You were fighting for it, Losing comes later when you stop fighting. You hadn't stopped. She considered that. Is that a distinction you actually believe, or is that you being diplomatic? I don't do diplomatic, he said. Ask Crow's lawyer. She smiled at the horizon, which was the way Clara smiled when she didn't particularly want to be caught at it. The matter of Silas Crow didn't end with the settlement payment. Some things don't end so much as they change form. What happened was that Crow's operational losses from the winter, combined with the settlement figure and the active investigation into the fence sabotage, which Aldridge had pursued with the steady, unglamorous persistence that characterized everything the sheriff did, had put him in a significantly weakened position. Two of the men he'd employed who'd been present on the night of the fence cutting had talked to Aldridge separately, apparently having reached the same calculation that Gideon had suggested to the rider in the dark. Crow's interests were not necessarily their interests. No formal charges were filed. The county in 1887 was not a place where the legal machinery moved quickly against a man of Crow's standing, and Gideon had never expected it to. What he'd expected and what happened was that the machinery of reputation moved instead. In a small county where everyone knew everyone's operations, the combination of a public survey dispute, a paid settlement, and an open sheriff's investigation constituted a particular kind of damage that money couldn't fully repair. Crow was not ruined, but he was diminished, which for a man whose authority rested heavily on the perception of being untouchable was a different kind of loss. He sold the northern section of his range by summer's end and withdrew mostly from county affairs. He didn't disappear. Men like Crow never fully disappear from the places they've held dominance. But the pressure on the Mercer Ranch stopped, not gradually. All at once, the way a headache stops, and you notice the absence more than you'd notice the presence. In June, Jed Hallett stopped by again. He looked better than he had in February. Some of the age the winter had put on him had come back off, the way it does when the immediate crisis passes and the body remembers what its baseline was. He sat on the porch with Gideon and Clara and drank coffee and talked about cattle prices and the road condition north of town and the general state of things, and eventually he said what he'd actually come to say. "My daughter asked me who survived the winter best in this county," he said. "I told her your operation. She asked why." He paused. "I told her I thought it was because you two were the only outfit that approached the whole winter, like a problem to solve together, rather than a series of separate emergencies to get through individually." He looked at his coffee mug. "I'm not sure I've operated that way with my wife in 26 years of ranching. Might be something to think about." After he left, Clara said, "That was a compliment and a confession in the same sentence." "Good man," Gideon said. "He'll be fine." The new agreement, the one that wasn't a contract, happened without ceremony, which was appropriate because neither of them were ceremonial people. It happened on an evening in late May, when the days had lengthened into genuine warmth and the south pasture was green and the eastern boundary grass was coming in well and the debt certificate was filed in the box under the desk where the original survey documents had been. Gideon had been at the kitchen table working through the summer planning. Which animals to sell, which to keep, the hay cutting schedule, the fence maintenance that needed doing before fall. Practical things. The kind of things you plan when you're thinking past the immediate season into the ones beyond it. Clara sat down across from him and folded her hands on the table in the way she did when she was about to say something she'd thought about carefully. "I have something to tell you," she said. He set down his pen. "You never took your wages," she said. "Not since December. I've reconciled every account entry and you put it all back." She paused. "That money is yours. I want you to know I know that, and I know what it cost you." "It didn't cost me anything I wanted for something else," he said. "I know." She looked at him steadily. "That's exactly what I mean." She took a breath. "I've been thinking about what you said in February, about the place being yours because of what you've put into it. Clara, you don't need to—" "I'm not done," she said, and he stopped. "I've been thinking about Robert, too, about what I owed him and how long I was going to owe it, and whether honoring his memory meant staying in place forever." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't think it does. I think what I owe him is to take care of what he started. This land, this operation. He wanted it to survive and grow and matter." She looked at Gideon. "I think you're the reason it's going to." He looked at her across the table, across the ledger books, and the account papers, and the survey documents, and the coffee cups that were always there between them, like the furniture of a life that had assembled itself around them without either of them entirely meaning for it to. "The arrangement we made in October," he said. "The practical one." "Yes. I'd like to make a different one. A real one." He held her gaze. "Not because we need to. Because I want to." Clara looked at him for a long moment, and then she said simply, "So do I." It wasn't a grand declaration. It didn't need to be. It was two people who had been honest with each other from the beginning, being honest about one more thing, the most important thing, which was that the practical structure they'd built had become indistinguishable from the real one. They were married in the same courthouse where Judge Briggs had read the same words the previous October, same judge, same desk, same courtroom. But Briggs, who had married 60-odd couples in his tenure and believed he could read the difference between people getting through a formality and people meaning it, shook both their hands at the end with something slightly warmer than his standard professional neutrality. "Congratulations," he said. This time, he meant it. And this time, so did they. The ranch they built through the years that followed wasn't a perfect operation. No working ranches. They had bad seasons and good ones, animals lost to illness and weather, and the ordinary attrition of frontier life, disputes with the county over road access that took 2 years to resolve, a summer drought in 1890 that cost them more hay than they could easily replace. There were arguments, like real ones, the kind that come from two people with strong opinions, and the mutual respect not to pretend they agree when they don't. Clara thought Gideon was too conservative with expansion. He thought she moved too fast on decisions that needed more information. They were both right about half the time, which is a better average than most. But the ranch survived and grew slowly, the way good things tend to grow. Not in dramatic leaps, but in steady increments, year over year, compounding. The eastern 41 acres became some of the most productive pasture on the property. The herd grew from 134 head to over 200 by 1892. The bunkhouse that Gideon had moved into on the first night became storage for equipment, and then a second barn, because the original barn had gotten too small for what they were doing. Jed Hallett's daughter, when she was old enough to ask the question properly, asked Clara once what she thought the real reason was that their operation had made it through everything. The debt, Crow, the winter, all of it. Clara thought about it for a moment. "Gideon once told me that what matters is knowing the difference between someone who's your enemy and someone who's just doing a job," she said. "I think that's part of it. We didn't waste energy on the wrong fights." "And the rest of it?" Clara looked out at the pasture, the eastern boundary that was theirs cleanly and completely now, the grass that had come back and kept coming back, the fence that had been cut and repaired and cut and repaired and now stood undisturbed. "We never let each other stop," she said. "When one of us was running out, the other one was still going. We took turns." She paused. "I think that's all it was. We just kept taking turns." Gideon, who had been close enough to hear, said nothing. He was fixing a fence post that had gone loose in the spring thaw, the same kind of maintenance work that never stopped being necessary, that was never entirely finished, that would go on needing doing as long as there was a ranch to maintain. He drove the post another inch into the ground with the mallet and checked it for steadiness. Solid. He moved to the next one. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. Not grand gestures, not dramatic victories, just the next thing, done as well as it could be done, and the one after that, and the one after that, until enough of them had accumulated into something that looked, from a distance, like a life. And for a man who had spent 6 years drifting across a country that had never offered him anywhere to belong, that was more than enough. That was everything.